This safety report is alarmist and doesn't reflect the business realities we're operating under. That's what Ryan Foster, our CEO, said during the executive meeting on a Wednesday morning in July 2023, dropping my 42-page safety assessment onto the conference table with the dismissive confidence of someone who believed regulatory compliance was optional paperwork that shouldn't interfere with production targets. Alarmist and not reflecting business realities. I'd been environmental health and safety manager at Precision Chemical Processing for 9 years, managing workplace safety protocols and regulatory compliance for our chemical manufacturing facility that processed hazardous materials under strict EPA and OSHA oversight, ensuring every safety procedure was followed and every regulatory requirement was met so that our 312 employees went home healthy every day and the company avoided the kind of violations that could result in facility shutdowns and criminal penalties. But according to Ryan, our CEO who'd been hired 18 months earlier from a private equity firm where he'd specialized in operational turnarounds at underperforming companies, my documentation of serious safety violations was creating unnecessary alarm that was slowing down his aggressive cost reduction initiatives. And he'd decided that my professional assessment of life-threatening hazards was expendable because it conflicted with his timeline for achieving profitability targets. I'm Cassandra Hayes, and I sat in that conference room at Precision Chemical watching Ryan explain how my safety report was overstating risks and not considering the financial constraints, while I knew exactly which OSHA regulations we were violating and exactly what would happen when inspectors eventually showed up to audit a facility that had been systematically cutting safety corners for 18 months. 9 years, 7 months, and 19 days of ensuring chemical processing operations met safety standards, building emergency response protocols that protected workers and communities, and Ryan had decided that safety compliance was an expense category that could be optimized away to improve quarterly financials. I wasn't the executive who set strategic direction or the operations manager who ran production lines. I drove a 2016 Subaru Outback with 142,000 miles on it and copies of OSHA regulations in the back seat because I reviewed safety standards during my lunch breaks when other managers were networking at restaurants. I lived in a modest apartment in Newark, Delaware, with a home office containing filing cabinets full of safety inspection reports, chemical exposure data, and emergency response plans that I developed because managing hazardous chemical operations requires understanding the regulations that prevent disasters. My bookshelf contained OSHA compliance guides, EPA hazardous waste regulations, and incident investigation reports from chemical facilities across the country that I'd studied to understand what happens when companies cut safety corners and how quickly workplace incidents can escalate into catastrophic events. I was detail-oriented, methodical about safety protocols, protective of worker health and environmental compliance, and apparently creating obstacles for a CEO who thought safety regulations were bureaucratic requirements that couldn't be allowed to interfere with his aggressive profit improvement plan. The trouble had started 18 months earlier when Precision Chemical's board of directors had hired Ryan Foster as CEO to improve operational efficiency and restore profitability after 3 years of declining margins. Precision Chemical manufactured specialty chemical compounds used in industrial applications, everything from metal treatment solutions to agricultural chemical intermediates to pharmaceutical precursor materials. The facility handled hazardous materials including corrosives, flammables, and toxic compounds that required strict safety protocols and regulatory compliance. Ryan came from a private equity background where he'd led operational transformations at portfolio companies, which meant identifying cost-cutting opportunities, eliminating non-essential expenses, and driving profitability improvements that made companies attractive for sale. He had that aggressive efficiency mindset, talking about lean operations, cost discipline, and challenging assumptions about necessary spending, that works well in service businesses but becomes dangerous when applied to chemical manufacturing where safety protocols exist to prevent injuries, environmental disasters, and regulatory violations. Ryan's first major initiative had been a comprehensive cost reduction program targeting 20% expense reduction across all departments within 12 months. Every department was required to identify opportunities to cut spending without materially impacting operations. For most departments, this meant reducing travel budgets, renegotiating vendor contracts, and eliminating discretionary spending. For environmental health and safety, it meant something very different and very dangerous. In March 2022, 3 months after Ryan became CEO, he'd called me into his office to discuss the EHS budget. Jordan, I'm looking at your department's spending and I see several areas where we might be overinvesting in safety and compliance. Your department budget is $840,000 annually, which is significantly higher than industry benchmarks for facilities of our size. I need you to identify opportunities to reduce EHS spending by at least 25%, that's $210,000, without compromising our ability to meet basic regulatory requirements. I'd explained that Precision Chemicals' EHS budget wasn't excessive, it reflected the reality of operating a chemical facility handling hazardous materials under strict regulatory oversight. The budget covered safety equipment maintenance, regulatory compliance monitoring, employee training, emergency response systems, air quality monitoring, wastewater treatment compliance, and hazardous waste management. All of these functions were required either by regulation or by operational necessity to prevent incidents. Ryan had responded that he'd reviewed chemical industry benchmarks and believed Precision was spending more on safety than competitors, which suggested we were gold-plating our compliance approach beyond what regulations actually required. He wanted me to find the difference between truly necessary safety spending and nice-to-have safety spending, and eliminate the latter category. Over the next 6 months, Ryan had systematically pressured me to reduce safety spending in ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable. In April 2022, he'd questioned whether we really needed quarterly air quality monitoring when regulations only required annual monitoring. I'd explained that quarterly monitoring allowed us to identify problems early before they became violations, and that the cost was minimal compared to the penalties for exceeding emission limits. Ryan had ordered me to reduce monitoring to the regulatory minimum, annual testing only. In June 2022, Ryan had challenged our preventive maintenance schedule for safety equipment. We had emergency eye wash stations, safety showers, ventilation systems, and chemical containment equipment that we maintained on proactive schedules to ensure reliability. Ryan wanted to shift to reactive maintenance, fixing equipment when it broke rather than maintaining it preventively. I'd explained that emergency safety equipment that doesn't work during an emergency is the definition of catastrophic failure. Ryan had insisted we could optimize maintenance spending by reducing the frequency of preventive service. In September 2022, Ryan had targeted our employee safety training program. OSHA requires hazardous material handling training, but our program went beyond minimum requirements with quarterly refresher training, specialized training for specific chemical processes, and hands-on emergency response drills. Ryan characterized this as excessive training and ordered me to reduce training to annual sessions covering only mandatory topics. By December 2022, 12 months into Ryan's cost-cutting program, Precision Chemicals' EHS budget had been reduced from $840,000 to $615,000, a 27% reduction that Ryan celebrated as exceeding his initial target. But the impact on actual safety and compliance was becoming alarming. The quarterly air quality monitoring we'd eliminated had been identifying minor exceedances that we could address proactively. Without that monitoring, we had no early warning system for emission problems. In October 2022, a process upset had caused elevated emissions that we didn't discover until the annual monitoring in March 2023 revealed we'd been exceeding permitted limits for 5 months. The preventive maintenance reductions were causing equipment reliability problems. In January 2023, an emergency eye wash station failed to activate during a chemical splash incident because the valve mechanism had corroded from lack of maintenance. The affected worker had to run to an alternate eye wash station, losing precious seconds that could have prevented eye damage. The worker suffered chemical burns requiring medical treatment. The training reductions meant employees were less prepared to respond to abnormal situations. In February 2023, a chemical spill occurred when an operator used incorrect procedure for transferring material between tanks. The operator hadn't received the specialized training that would have covered that specific operation because Ryan had eliminated specialized training as non-essential. By April 2023, I'd documented a pattern of safety incidents and near misses that were directly traceable to Ryan's cost-cutting decisions. I'd raised these concerns with Ryan multiple times, explaining that we were trading short-term cost savings for increased risk of serious incidents. Ryan's response was consistently that I was being overly cautious and not understanding the financial pressure the company was under. In May 2023, I'd begun preparing a comprehensive safety assessment documenting all the ways that Ryan's cost reductions had compromised facility safety and regulatory compliance. I'd worked on this assessment for 6 weeks, reviewing incident reports, analyzing equipment maintenance records, comparing our current practices against regulatory requirements, and identifying specific violations of OSHA and EPA regulations that resulted from the reduced safety spending. The final report, completed in late June 2023, was 42 pages long. It documented 14 specific areas where Precision Chemical was now operating in violation of OSHA regulations, 8 areas where we'd violated EPA air quality and wastewater permits, and 23 safety equipment or procedure deficiencies that created immediate risk of serious worker injury or environmental release. The report included specific recommendations for correcting each deficiency, with associated costs totaling approximately $380,000 to bring the facility back into full compliance. On July 12, 2023, I presented the report to Ryan and the executive team. My presentation had outlined the key findings. Precision Chemical had systematic safety and environmental compliance problems resulting from inadequate maintenance, insufficient training, and reduced monitoring that had been implemented as cost-cutting measures. These problems created serious risk of worker injury, environmental violations, and regulatory enforcement that could include facility shutdown orders, criminal penalties, and personal liability for executives who knowingly allowed violations to continue. Ryan's response had been the dismissive comment about the report being alarmist and not reflecting business realities. He'd then spent 20 minutes explaining to the executive team why my assessment was flawed. According to Ryan, I was using worst-case scenarios to exaggerate risks. I was over-interpreting regulatory requirements to make optional best practices sound like mandatory compliance obligations, and I was not considering the financial context, where Precision Chemical needed to reduce costs to survive. Ryan's conclusion: we're not going to spend $400,000 fixing problems that Jordan thinks might possibly create issues at some theoretical future point. We're going to continue operating with appropriate cost discipline, and we're going to trust that Jordan can manage safety and compliance within her existing budget constraints. If regulatory agencies show up and find problems, we'll address those specific issues at that time. But we're not going to panic about a list of theoretical concerns. I tried to explain that these weren't theoretical concerns, they were documented violations of specific regulatory requirements. Ryan had cut me off. Jordan, I appreciate your thoroughness, but I need you to understand that running a business requires balancing multiple priorities. Safety is important, but so is financial viability. Your report reads like a lawyer's worst-case litigation memo rather than a practical operational assessment. I'm not approving this spending, and I expect you to manage safety and compliance within your current budget. Now about 73% of you think I'm about to anonymously tip off regulators or deliberately trigger an inspection, and you're completely wrong. Subscribe right now, because what actually happens is that regulatory agencies do exactly what they're designed to do: conduct routine inspections to verify compliance, identify violations when companies cut corners, and enforce penalties when executives knowingly allow hazardous conditions. And CEOs who think safety regulations are optional learn expensive lessons about why those regulations have criminal penalties attached. After the July 12 meeting where Ryan dismissed my safety report, I had a decision to make. I could quietly accept Ryan's decision and hope nothing catastrophic happened before the board or regulators discovered the problems. Or I could document everything carefully, continue raising concerns through proper channels, and ensure that when the inevitable regulatory inspection happened, my professional responsibility to worker safety and regulatory compliance was clearly on record. I chose documentation. On July 15, I sent a follow-up email to Ryan, the executive team, and Precision Chemical's board of directors. The email summarized my safety assessment findings and stated clearly, Precision Chemical is currently operating in violation of multiple OSHA and EPA regulations. These violations create immediate risk of worker injury and environmental release. I have identified specific corrective actions required to achieve compliance. Management has declined to authorize the spending necessary to correct these violations. This email serves as formal documentation that I have raised these concerns with executive leadership and board oversight, and that I cannot be held professionally responsible for safety or compliance failures that result from management decisions to operate with known violations. The email was carefully worded to avoid sounding like a threat while making crystal clear that I'd documented the problems, I'd raised them to the highest levels of company leadership, and I was protecting my professional liability by ensuring everyone understood that I wasn't the one choosing to operate with known safety violations. Ryan called me into his office the next day. He was furious. "Jordan, that email you sent to the board was completely inappropriate. You're creating alarm about safety issues that we've already discussed and decided how to handle. You're making it sound like I'm recklessly endangering workers, when what's actually happening is that I'm making tough business decisions in a difficult financial environment. I need you to send a follow-up email clarifying that your concerns are about theoretical risks rather than imminent dangers." I refused. "Ryan, my assessment documents actual violations of specific OSHA and EPA regulations. These aren't theoretical risks, they're current conditions that don't meet regulatory requirements. I can't send an email mischaracterizing my professional findings because that would make me personally liable when regulators identify the same violations. My responsibility as EHS manager is to identify safety and compliance problems and recommend solutions. Your responsibility as CEO is to decide whether to authorize the spending to fix those problems. You've made your decision. I've documented mine." Ryan's tone shifted to threatening. "Jordan, I'm going to be very direct. You need to decide whether you're a team player who supports the company's financial recovery, or whether you're going to continue creating problems by overstating safety concerns and going around me to the board. If you can't get on board with the direction I'm taking this company, then maybe you're not the right person for this role." I responded calmly. "I'm absolutely a team player when it comes to legitimate business decisions. But I'm not going to compromise my professional ethics or expose myself to personal liability by staying silent about documented safety violations. If you want to operate with known OSHA violations, that's your decision as CEO. But I'm going to ensure there's clear documentation that I identified these problems and recommended corrective action." The conversation ended poorly. Ryan made it clear he viewed me as disloyal and difficult. Over the next 2 months, our relationship was increasingly tense. Ryan excluded me from executive meetings, questioned my budget requests, and made comments to other managers suggesting I was overly focused on compliance at the expense of business results. But the documented violations I'd identified weren't going away. The equipment reliability problems continued to worsen. In August 2023, a ventilation system failure caused elevated chemical vapor exposure in one of our processing areas. The exposure didn't cause immediate injury, but it exceeded OSHA permissible exposure limits and should have been reported as a recordable incident. Ryan instructed me not to record it, claiming the exposure was brief and didn't cause actual harm. I documented Ryan's instruction in writing and then reported the incident anyway, because failing to record OSHA recordable incidents is itself a violation. In September 2023, our wastewater treatment system had a malfunction that caused us to discharge wastewater that exceeded our EPA permit limits. The discharge was detected by our monitoring equipment. EPA regulations required us to report the permit exceedance within 24 hours. Ryan instructed me to wait and see if the problem repeats before reporting, because he didn't want to trigger a regulatory response over what he characterized as a one-time upset. I explained that delayed reporting of permit violations is a separate violation that carries additional penalties. Ryan told me to use my judgment. I reported the discharge to EPA within 24 hours as required. By late September 2023, I'd become convinced that it was only a matter of time before Precision Chemical faced a major regulatory inspection that would identify the systematic violations I'd been documenting. Companies in our industry are subject to periodic inspections by OSHA and EPA. These inspections can be routine scheduled inspections, or they can be triggered by worker complaints, incident reports, or permit violations. Given that we'd had a recordable injury incident and a wastewater permit exceedance in recent months, the probability of an inspection was increasing. On October 3, 2023, an OSHA compliance officer showed up at Precision Chemicals' front gate requesting access to conduct a comprehensive safety inspection. The inspection had been triggered by a complaint from a worker who'd reported concerns about chemical exposure and inadequate safety equipment maintenance. OSHA is required to investigate such complaints, and they'd assigned an inspector to conduct a wall-to-wall inspection of our facility. Ryan was caught completely off guard. He called me into his office. OSHA is here for an inspection. This is because of that worker's complaint about the ventilation system failure in August, isn't it? You recorded that incident even though I told you it wasn't necessary, and now it's triggered a regulatory inspection that's going to cost us time and money to manage. I corrected him. Ryan, recording OSHA reportable incidents is legally required. Failing to record them is a violation. The inspection was triggered by a worker complaint, which workers have a legal right to file if they have safety concerns. And given the systematic safety problems I documented in my July report, problems you declined to fix, this inspection is going to identify multiple violations. The OSHA inspection lasted 3 days. The compliance officer was thorough, reviewing our safety programs, inspecting equipment, interviewing workers, and examining maintenance records. I cooperated fully with the inspection, providing requested documentation and answering questions honestly. Ryan instructed me to be strategic about what information I provided to the inspector, implying I should downplay problems or provide incomplete information. I refused, explaining that providing false or misleading information to OSHA inspectors is a federal crime. On October 6, the third day of inspection, the OSHA compliance officer conducted a closing conference with Ryan, myself, and Precision Chemicals legal counsel. The inspector presented preliminary findings. Precision Chemical had committed 18 serious violations of OSHA regulations, including inadequate hazard communication, insufficient emergency equipment maintenance, inadequate employee training, lack of required safety procedures, and inadequate monitoring of workplace exposures. Each serious violation carried a penalty of up to $13,654. Estimated total penalties, $245,000. The inspector also noted that several of the violations appeared to be willful, meaning management knew about the hazards and failed to correct them. Willful violations carry penalties up to $136,540 per violation. If OSHA determined that any violations were willful, the penalties could increase substantially. Ryan tried to argue with the inspector, claiming the violations were technical interpretations of regulations that Precision was substantially complying with. The inspector calmly explained that substantial compliance wasn't a defense under OSHA regulations. Either you meet the requirements or you don't. The inspector also noted that the company's own EHS manager had documented these same violations in a comprehensive report 3 months earlier, which management had declined to address. This suggested management had knowingly allowed violations to continue, which was precisely the definition of willful violation. 2 weeks later, on October 20, EPA conducted a follow-up inspection related to our September wastewater permit exceedance. The EPA inspector reviewed our air quality monitoring records, wastewater treatment operations, and hazardous waste management procedures. The inspection identified 8 violations of EPA regulations, including inadequate air quality monitoring, failure to maintain required records, wastewater treatment deficiencies, and hazardous waste storage violations. EPA's preliminary penalty assessment, $320,000. In early November 2023, Precision Chemical received formal citations from both OSHA and EPA. The combined penalties totaled $565,000. But the financial penalties were just the beginning. Both agencies issued corrective action orders requiring Precision to immediately fix all identified violations, implement comprehensive safety and environmental management systems, and submit to enhanced regulatory oversight for the next 2 years. The corrective actions required essentially everything I'd recommended in my July safety report, plus additional requirements imposed by the regulators. The total cost, approximately $640,000 in immediate corrective actions, plus ongoing costs for enhanced monitoring, training, and compliance reporting. Ryan called an emergency board meeting on November 8 to explain the regulatory enforcement situation. The board was furious. Ryan had promised operational improvements and cost savings. Instead, he'd created a regulatory crisis that would cost more than $600,000 to resolve, plus $565,000 in penalties, plus reputational damage with customers and communities. The board asked Ryan directly, "Did anyone warn you that your cost-cutting measures would create safety and compliance problems?" Ryan tried to minimize. Our EHS manager raised some concerns about theoretical risks, but she was overstating the issues and not considering our financial constraints. I was in the meeting as a non-voting attendee. The board chair looked at me. "Cassandra, is that an accurate characterization?" I responded clearly. In July, I presented a 42-page safety assessment documenting 14 specific OSHA violations and 8 EPA violations resulting from cost-cutting measures. I recommended corrective actions costing $380,000. Ryan characterized my assessment as alarmist and declined to authorize the spending. I documented my concerns in writing to Ryan, the executive team, and the board. The violations that OSHA and EPA subsequently identified are the same violations I documented 3 months earlier. The board chair asked to see my July report. I provided it. The board spent 30 minutes reviewing my documentation and comparing it against the OSHA and EPA citations. The overlap was nearly perfect. I'd identified 18 safety violations, OSHA had cited 18 violations. I'd identified 8 environmental violations, and the EPA had cited 8 violations. One board member asked Ryan directly, if Cassandra identified these problems in July and recommended spending $380,000 to fix them, and you declined, and now we're spending $640,000 to fix the same problems plus $565,000 in penalties, can you explain how that was good business judgment? Ryan didn't have a good answer. On November 15, 2023, the board terminated Ryan Foster as CEO. The board appointed an interim CEO and began a search for permanent leadership with experience managing regulated industrial operations. On November 20th, the interim CEO called me into his office. "Cassandra, I've reviewed what happened here. You did everything right, you identified the problems, you documented them, you raised them to the highest levels, and you were ignored. You protected workers, you protected the company from worse liability, and you maintained your professional ethics despite pressure to compromise. The board wants to offer you expanded responsibilities and significant compensation adjustment to recognize your judgment and integrity." My title became Vice President of Environmental Health and Safety and Regulatory Compliance, reporting directly to the CEO. My salary increased from $89,000 to $147,000, a 65% increase. I was given authority to veto any operational decision that created unacceptable safety or compliance risk, and I was added to the board as a non-voting observer to ensure safety and compliance perspective was included in all strategic decisions. Over the next year, I led Precision Chemicals' corrective action program. We fixed all the violations identified by regulators. We rebuilt our safety and environmental management systems. We restored the preventive maintenance programs, monitoring systems, and training that Ryan had eliminated. We passed follow-up inspections from both OSHA and EPA. And we did all of this while maintaining production operations and improving our safety record. In November 2024, I ran into Ryan at an industry conference. He was working as an independent operations consultant, trying to rebuild his reputation after being terminated from Precision Chemical. He saw me and approached cautiously. "Cassandra, I heard you got promoted after I left. VP of EHS, that's a significant role." I looked at him steadily. "I got promoted because I maintained professional integrity and protected worker safety despite being pressured to compromise. You got terminated because you ignored documented safety violations to achieve short-term cost savings, and that created a regulatory crisis that cost the company over $1 million. Ryan tried to defend himself. Those violations were technical issues that safety professionals always overstate. I was making business decisions in a difficult financial situation. I responded firmly. They weren't technical issues, they were violations of federal regulations designed to prevent worker injuries and environmental damage. I gave you a detailed report documenting every violation. You dismissed it as alarmist. Then OSHA and EPA showed up and cited the company for exactly the same violations I'd identified. That's not an overstating risk, that's a professional safety assessment that you ignored because it conflicted with your cost-cutting targets. Ryan didn't have a response. He walked away. Thanks for staying through this entire story, everyone who's ever tried to maintain professional safety and compliance standards while being pressured by executives who think regulations are optional obstacles to profit. If this resonated with you, if you've ever documented serious safety problems only to be told you're being overly cautious, subscribe and share your story. These workplace tales remind us that safety regulations exist for good reasons, that regulatory agencies will eventually inspect facilities and identify violations, and that executives who ignore warnings from safety professionals learn expensive lessons when regulators arrive with citation books and penalty assessments.